June 6, 1944, Tokyo, 9:20 p.m. Rain pattered softly against the tall windows of the Imperial Army War Ministry. Outside, the city was hushed under the wartime blackout. Only the dim glow of a few guarded lanterns cut through the drizzle. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and unease. Officers in pressed khaki stood shoulder-to-shoulder, eyes fixed on a map of Europe pinned to the wall. Each red line marked a report received from Berlin, and each new telegram seemed worse than the last. A courier from the German embassy had arrived, breathless rain dripping from his cap. He held a folder sealed in wax. "Urgent situation in France," he said in clipped Japanese. The duty officer tore it open. A moment later, the words echoed across the room like gunfire Allied landings Normandy. At first there was disbelief. The Allies had been expected to strike at Calais or not at all. But as the night unfolded, the picture sharpened. Not hundreds, but thousands of ships were crossing the English Channel. A sea of steel unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the flickering light of the radio sets, the faces of Japan's generals tightened. No one spoke for a long time. The sound of typewriter keys stuttered in the corner as an aide transcribed the incoming reports. Each line felt heavier than the last. One general, grey-haired eyes sunken from months of sleeplessness, slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. Another reached for a cigarette with trembling hands. They said, 5,000 vessels, murmured Colonel Nakajima, breaking the silence. Closer to 6, someone replied. And they just keep coming. They all understood what that meant. This was not merely an invasion, it was an industrial event. The United States had done something inconceivable, built an army and a navy so vast that the geography of war itself could be reshaped overnight. A younger officer whispered, "This must be the largest fleet in history." The intelligence chief nodded grimly. "It is," he said, "and it was built in less than 2 years." For a moment the only sound was the rain and the faint hum of a ceiling fan spinning above them. Then General Kawabe exhaled and muttered a name almost reverently, Yamamoto. The room turned. Everyone knew what he meant. 3 years earlier, before Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had written a private letter to the Prime Minister. In it, he had made a prophecy. "I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year," he warned, "but after that I have no confidence." Back then those words were dismissed as pessimism. Now they sounded like scripture. Kawabe looked down at the telegram again. The Allies had landed 150,000 troops in 1 day more men than Japan could transport across the Pacific in a month. The arithmetic was merciless. Japan's remaining navy could fit within a single Allied anchorage. Every factory lost to bombing, every ship sunk at sea, every drop of fuel burned over China. It had all been leading here to this quiet realization. He lit his cigarette. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "we are witnessing the mathematics of defeat." No one contradicted him. Even the diehards stayed silent. They could see it now. The war was being decided not by bravery or spirit, but by the cold, relentless equation of production. America had solved that equation, and the answer was overwhelming force. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark sky over Tokyo Bay. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded another convoy carrying munitions to nowhere. Inside the war room, the general stood frozen, listening to the rain and the static on the radio. In that silence, Yamamoto's words seemed to echo from the grave. "After that, I have no confidence." Morning light crept through the blinds of the Imperial General Headquarters. General Hideki Tojo stood before a stack of papers nearly 1/2 meter high. Intelligence summaries intercepted radio traffic, translated economic reports from Washington. Each document told the same story, but the meaning was almost impossible to face. The pages trembled slightly in his hands, not from the draft through the window, but from something deeper. "America," he murmured, as though repeating the word might make it smaller. Across the room, a young aide read aloud the newest dispatch from Berlin. At Normandy, over 5,000 vessels were identified landing craft destroyers, transports, battleships. The sea itself seemed paved with steel. The officer faltered, lowering the paper. 5,000, sir." Tojo nodded grimly. He had already seen the numbers in his intelligence folder: 5,000 Allied ships, 150,000 men in a single day. And beyond that, a far more terrifying figure: the rate of replacement. The Americans could lose entire fleets and rebuild them before the next season changed. He turned the page. It was an industrial report compiled by spies in San Francisco and reports from diplomats in neutral countries. The figures were unbelievable. 1 aircraft carrier every month, One new Liberty ship every 8 hours. Factories working 3 shifts a day lit by the glare of welding torches that never went dark. In Detroit, the Ford River Rouge plant rolled out tanks like automobiles, 1 every hour. At Willow Run B-24, bombers came off the line so quickly that they had to be towed to nearby fields for space. In California, women stood on assembly scaffolds with rivet guns in hand, Rosie the Riveters in bandanas and goggles, each one turning steel and aluminum into weapons of war. The reports described rail lines choked with Sherman tanks, highways filled with trucks ports stacked with crates labelled Forward Theatre. Even the numbers for aircraft defied belief: 85,000 planes in a single year. Tojo placed a finger on the paper, tracing the numbers like a man reading his own sentence. Then he turned to another sheet, Japan's production figures for the same month. 50. 5 ships, that was all. Japan's shipyards were starving for steel. The refineries at Palembang and Tarakan had been bombed, and fuel now arrived in rusted drums hidden beneath fishing nets. Pilots were trained for flight hours measured in minutes. The proud Imperial Navy, once the envy of Asia, was reduced to sending destroyers on missions with barely enough fuel for the return trip. He walked to the window. Beyond the palace walls, Tokyo's skyline was dark, its chimneys cold. The factories that had once hammered out Zero fighters and artillery shells now struggled to stay alive without raw materials. Trains rolled past, not with weapons, but with rice for starving civilians. He remembered Yamamoto's warning again. A war with America will not end well. We can fight for 6 months, perhaps a year. 6 months had turned into 3 years. The arithmetic no longer required imagination. It was now written across the world in smoke and steel. The next report on Tojo's desk came from the Home Ministry. It described a strange new aircraft sighted at great altitude over Kyushu Silver bombers, flying higher than any Japanese interceptor could reach. The B-29 Super Fortress. They called it the Flying Fortress of the Pacific. For now it was only a rumour, but Tojo understood what it meant. The war was moving closer to the Japanese homeland, and soon even the skies above Tokyo would not be safe. He sat down heavily in his chair. The ticking of the clock grew loud. For years his speeches had promised that the spirit of Yamato would overcome Western materialism. But as he stared at the mountain of American production data, the rhetoric felt hollow. This was not a war of spirit anymore. It was a war of supply lines. Tojo closed the folder. It was never about bravery, he said quietly. It was about numbers. One of his generals looked up, so Tojo didn't answer at first. He rose, walked to the map of the Pacific that hung on the far wall. Red pins marked Japanese garrisons. Blue pins, American fleets seemed to multiply each week. The pattern told the truth more clearly than any report could. He rested his hand on the map, tracing the long arc from Hawaii to the Marianas, then to the Philippines. Each island was another step closer to Tokyo, another calculation in the same unstoppable equation. Finally he spoke, his voice little more than a whisper, as though saying it aloud might wake something even larger. "We thought we had caught a giant asleep," he said. But he was only dreaming. We awakened him. He looked back at the trembling papers on his desk, the thunder outside, the faint rumble of distant aircraft engines on patrol over Tokyo Bay. His hand fell to his side. The giant never slept, he murmured, only waited. The polished corridors of the Imperial Palace carried a strange echo that morning, a hush that swallowed every footstep. Even the guards at the marble archways stood more rigid than usual, eyes forward, faces pale. The air smelled faintly of rain and cedar, the scent that always drifted through the garden ponds after a storm. Inside the chrysanthemum chamber, the senior members of Japan's high command waited in silence. Their caps rested neatly on their knees, their swords angled precisely toward the floor. No one dared speak above a whisper. To be summoned directly by the emperor was extraordinary. To be questioned by him was almost unheard of. When Emperor Hirohito entered, every man bowed low enough to touch his forehead to the floor. The ritual of reverence took nearly a full minute, each movement choreographed, each breath measured. When they rose, he was already seated behind his lacquered desk, a white-gloved hand resting beside a stack of dispatches. His eyes were calm, unreadable. "Gentlemen," he began softly, "I have read the reports from Europe." No one moved. The clicking of the wall clock seemed unbearably loud. He turned a single sheet of paper toward them, the German communiqué describing the Normandy invasion. Rows of figures, ship tonnage, casualty estimates, the number of landing craft. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "If America can invade Europe with this force, What will they bring to Japan? The question hung in the air like a blade. The generals shifted, exchanging helpless glances. None wanted to speak first. For years, the emperor's role had been that of a sacred figure, not to be burdened with military detail, not to be exposed to the ugliness of failure. Yet here he was breaking his own distance, asking the question every man in the room feared to answer. Marshal Sugiyama cleared his throat. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the Americans are far away. Our island defences, our spirit." Hirohito raised a hand. The gesture was small, but it silenced him instantly. He repeated the words slowly as though measuring their weight. "If they can cross one ocean," he said, "they can cross another." A heavy quiet returned. The emperor's tone was not angry, not even accusatory. It was worse, curious, almost sorrowful. It was the voice of a man who had spent his life above humanity, now beginning to feel its frailty. Admiral Yunai, standing near the back, finally spoke. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice trembling just slightly, "forgive me, but they may not need to invade us at all." The emperor turned his gaze toward him. "Explain." Yunai hesitated, aware of every heartbeat. Their bombers grow larger each month. Their bases move closer. Marshall, then Saipan, perhaps the Philippines next. When they can reach our cities from the air, they will destroy our factories, our harbours, our people. The invasion will happen from the sky. No one breathed. The thought itself was heresy to imagine the homeland itself reduced to rubble. The emperor's subjects burned in their sleep. Yet the logic was flawless. The Americans were building a new kind of war, one fought not just on land and sea, but in the air with machines Japan could no longer hope to match. Hirohito lowered his eyes to the paper again. The faint scratch of his fountain pen filled the silence. Then he said quietly, "We must find a way to end this war before such a day comes." Before anyone could respond, the door slid open sharply. A chamberlain hurried in, breathless, holding a folded telegram. The guards at the threshold stiffened. The man knelt and held out the message with both hands. "From the Southern Command, Your Majesty. Urgent." General Anami took it, eyes narrowing as he read the 5 words scrawled across the flimsy paper. His hand began to tremble. He looked up. "It's from the Philippines," he said. "They've decoded a message from the American fleet." He swallowed hard, then spoke the words that froze the room. "The Americans are coming back." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The line between past and future vanished. MacArthur's vow, once dismissed as theatre, was now reality. The Pacific, once Japan's ocean, had turned against her. Hirohito's expression did not change. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening to the echo of something far away, the faint rumble of engines, perhaps, or the whisper of a tide that would never retreat. When he opened them again, his voice was softer still. "Then our time," he said, "is shorter than we believed." The telegram from Manila lay unfolded on the polished table of the Imperial General Staff, its paper still creased from the hands that had carried it across half an empire. 5 words. That was all it said. The Americans are coming back. Yet those words carried the weight of prophecy, the echo of a promise made 2 years earlier on the shores of the same islands. When General Douglas MacArthur fled the Philippines in 1942, he had turned toward the cameras, toward his soldiers, dying behind him, and sworn 3 words the Japanese never forgot: "I shall return." In Tokyo, that had once been a line of ridicule-proof of Western arrogance. But now in October 1944, the vow had come full circle. The Americans were not just returning, they were coming with the full remorseless machinery of an industrial nation at war. Radio reports from the south were fragmented but unmistakable massed landings at Leyte, thousands of aircraft overhead, naval bombardment without pause. The Empire's southern lifeline, its oil, its access to Southeast Asia, was being cut apart in real time. In the war room, a young officer whispered, "They're attacking with the same force they used at Normandy." The comparison was not exaggeration. The Pacific was now experiencing its own D-Day, an invasion of seas so dense with Allied vessels that Japanese spotters described the ocean as covered with ants. At Leyte Gulf, Japan threw everything it had left. Admirals Kurita Ozawa and Nishimura led what remained of the Imperial Navy into what would become the largest naval battle in human history. Carriers without planes, battleships without escorts, crews with barely any fuel left in their tanks. The strategy was desperate: use deception, lure the American fleet north, then strike their transports with whatever suicide attacks could be mustered. It was there amid the smoke and the rising sun that the first organised kamikaze missions began. Young men with bright headbands carrying photographs of their families saluted before climbing into cockpits filled with explosives. The word kamikaze divine wind had once been a poetic legend from Japan's medieval past. Now it was reality born from the ashes of a dying empire. Back in Tokyo, reports arrived hourly. None of them brought comfort. The Battle of Leyte Gulf became a requiem for Japan's naval power. 4 carriers and 3 battleships went down, along with hundreds of planes that could never be replaced. The seas that had once protected the empire were now corridors of Allied dominance. General Tojo sat at the long table, listening to the static of a broken radio transmission. Yamato-class battleship hit, flames spreading. Abandoning ship. He closed his eyes. Yamamoto was right, he murmured. He said we could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. He looked up, meeting the gaze of the others. It has been 3 years. We are ghosts of his warning. Someone tried to respond, to argue for morale, for honor, but the words dissolved before they reached the air. Everyone knew the truth. The empire's perimeter had collapsed. The Philippines were the hinge that held the door to Asia. Once that door fell, the Americans would have a straight path north to Okinawa, to the Ryukyus, and finally to the home islands themselves. On one wall hung a large map of the Pacific. Blue pins marked the enemy's progress. Each week another island turned from red to blue. The Mariana Islands gone, Guam gone, Saipan gone. Each loss was a stepping stone for the B-29 bombers, now rumoured to be preparing for nightly raids on Tokyo. General Anami traced the route with his finger. Once Germany falls, he said softly, America will have no other war, no other distraction. Every ship, every plane, every man, they will all turn east. A colonel standing nearby whispered, and when that happens, Anami's hand stopped over the Japanese archipelago. Then he said the full weight of their world will fall upon ours. A long silence followed. Outside, the winter rain had begun again, tapping softly against the windows. Someone poured tea into porcelain cups, but no one drank. Across the table, a younger officer stared at the map with hollow eyes. If this continues, he said, our people will have nothing left to defend but ruins. No one argued. They were trained to speak in euphemisms to hide fear behind words like honour and sacrifice. But that night those words felt like brittle paper. Finally one general leaned back, his voice barely audible over the ticking clock. We cannot win this, he said. No one asked him to repeat it. They all knew. The war was no longer a question of victory, only of how long the inevitable could be delayed. The thunder from the south echoed faintly through the radio artillery engines, the final stand of soldiers who still believed in an empire that no longer existed. And far away across the Pacific, a tall figure in a corncob pipe stepped ashore through the surf of Leyte, surrounded by cameras as if fate itself wanted the world to see what he had promised. General Douglas MacArthur looked toward the horizon and said quietly, People of the Philippines, I have returned. In Tokyo, the men who heard those words did not need a translation. They understood what they meant for the empire and for themselves. The return of MacArthur was not simply the beginning of the end. It was the proof the end had already begun. It was past midnight when the doors of the Imperial Army War Ministry closed for the final time that day. The corridors usually patrolled by aides and messengers were empty now. Only a single lantern burned at the end of the hall, its light trembling on the polished floor. Inside the map room, 6 men gathered in silence, the most senior commanders of the Empire. No aides, no stenographers, no written minutes. This meeting would not exist in the archives. A kettle hissed softly on a side table, but no one touched it. The air was heavy with fatigue and the smell of damp uniforms. General Anami stood near the window, his back turned, watching the faint orange glow of Tokyo's distant fires. Behind him, General Umezu spoke, first his voice little more than a whisper. We must consider the possibility of peace. The others said nothing. The words themselves were dangerous, treasonous even. For years, the government's propaganda had been built on a single belief: surrender was worse than death. The Bushido Code had become a national religion drilled into every citizen from childhood: die before dishonour, perish before shame. To even suggest negotiation was to betray the souls of the dead. Anami turned slowly. Peace, he said, the word tasting foreign. You mean surrender. Umezu met his gaze. I mean survival. For a moment the room seemed to contract. Every man there had served under the creed of the divine emperor, a living god who could not be defeated. But each also knew the truth that could not be spoken aloud: the war was lost. The Philippines were gone, the navy shattered, the homeland exposed. The army could still fight, yes, but only to bleed. General Kawabe unfolded a small folder, its paper thin from handling. The Home Ministry is already warning of food shortages. Civilian casualties from the B-29 raids exceed all estimates. If the Americans invade the home islands, the death toll will reach millions. Anami's hand tightened on the window frame. Then we die with them, he said, quietly. If the nation falls, we fall with it. Better annihilation than humiliation. Umezu shook his head. Tell that to the children of Tokyo, to the mothers digging through the ruins. The room fell still again. Outside, thunder murmured somewhere over the Pacific. They all remembered Saipan. That had been the Empire's first taste of collective death. In July 1944, when defeat was certain, entire families had thrown themselves from the island's cliffs. Civilians leapt into the sea, clutching their infants, convinced by propaganda that the Americans would torture them. It was called Gyokusai, the Shattered Jewel, the belief that dying for the emperor preserved purity. The government had turned it into a slogan: 100 million die together. And now those same men were being asked to consider surrender to live not as jewels, but as men stripped of myth. Admiral Yonai broke the silence. Perhaps there is another path, he said carefully. The Soviets. They remain neutral in the Pacific. We could ask them to mediate a peace honourable terms, not unconditional surrender. For a fleeting moment the idea seemed to offer relief. Moscow still maintained a non-aggression pact with Japan, and Stalin, opportunistic as ever, had not yet declared war. Perhaps some thought diplomacy could buy time enough to preserve the throne, maybe even Japan's sovereignty. But the hope was fragile, and everyone knew it. The Americans demanded unconditional surrender. No negotiation, no compromise, no divine status preserved. The emperor himself might be tried as a war criminal. That was the unthinkable part, not merely losing the war, but losing him. Anami's voice softened almost to a whisper. If His Majesty falls, Japan ceases to exist. Our spirit dies. Umezu sighed. Our people will die with it regardless if we continue this way. For a long time no one spoke. The sound of rain returned, tapping against the shutters like a patient reminder. They were trapped between two absolutes: honour and annihilation. One of the younger generals, his voice trembling, finally asked, "What if? We make the cost too high for America. If every invasion becomes a graveyard, they may settle for peace." It was desperation speaking, but no one dismissed it. They imagined beaches littered with wreckage mountains, fortified with tunnels, civilians armed with bamboo spears. If the enemy's blood price was unbearable, perhaps the Americans would relent. That then became the new logic: to prolong the war, not to win, but to negotiate through suffering. Anami turned back to the window, watching the flashes of distant lightning. Then we shall prepare for the final battle, he said. Operation Ketsugo, the decisive defence. The others nodded slowly. They would fight on knowing the truth but unable to face it. Outside the rain ceased. The city lay quiet under a moonless sky, unaware of the secret meeting that had just determined its fate. None of them could know what scientists in the deserts of New Mexico were doing. That same month, splitting the atom, building a weapon that would render every calculation, every strategy, every sacrifice meaningless. When dawn came, the generals dispersed without a word. No records, no signatures, no witnesses. Only the sound of wet boots in an empty corridor, and the faint echo of what had just been decided: Japan would continue the war against logic, against mercy, against time itself. By the summer of 1945, Japan had become a nation of smoke and shadows. Every night the sky over Tokyo glowed red, then black, then red again. The B-29 superfortresses came in waves, dozens then hundreds, until the city itself seemed to dissolve beneath them. Entire neighbourhoods vanished in the time it took to boil water. Wooden homes burned like paper. The heat melted glass into rivers. From the air, Tokyo was a living firestorm. From the ground, it was the sound of the world ending. Mothers clutching children ran toward canals already full of the dead. One survivor later wrote in her diary, "The air itself was on fire. The sky rained ash instead of snow." By June, the same fate had come to Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama. Over 60 Japanese cities lay in ruins. In some, more than half the population was gone. The railways stopped running except for military trains, and entire prefectures lived without electricity. Yet the radio still spoke of victory. "Citizens of the Empire," the announcer's voice boomed through static, "our divine spirit cannot be broken. Every man, woman and child must prepare for the decisive battle on the homeland." But in the shelters, people no longer looked up when those words played. They were too hungry, too tired, too aware of the lie. Children drew pictures of airplanes on scraps of cardboard and asked their mothers which city would burn next. Inside the underground chambers of the General Staff, new maps were drawn: Operation Downfall, the defence of the homeland. The plan was monstrous in its scale: 2 million soldiers waiting in tunnels, civilians trained with bamboo spears, suicide boats hidden along the beaches. Every kilometre of coastline was marked for blood. The calculations were staggering even to the Americans. Their planners estimated that the invasion of Kyushu and Honshu would kill at least 1 million Allied troops and perhaps 10 million Japanese civilians. Yet Tokyo approved the plan. Ketsugo, the final battle, would preserve honour through death. In late July, a letter arrived from Potsdam. It was a final Allied warning: surrender unconditionally, or face prompt and utter destruction. The cabinet read it in silence. Then they rejected it. They could not bear to speak the word surrender. August 5th. Hiroshima slept beneath a clear sky. In a schoolyard, children practiced bucket brigades against imaginary fires. Farmers headed toward the Otter River, and office workers in starched white shirts began their morning walks to the tram. At 8:15 a.m, the air rippled with a low metallic hum. One man looked up and saw a silver plane glinting at 30,000 feet. Then a small white blossom fell beneath it. For a moment there was only silence, then light. It was not the flash of an explosion, but something purer, brighter, merciless. The city vanished in a single heartbeat. Windows melted, shadows burned into concrete. People who had stood in the open left their outlines on walls, their bodies turned to air. A doctor who survived wrote later, there was no sound. Only a white light that erased everything. Houses, streets, the boundary between life and death. 3 days later, as if the world had not yet learned, Nagasaki followed. The second bomb fell through clouds at 11:02 a.m. The valley city burst into flame, its cathedral dome collapsing in a wave of heat. Even the mountains turned red. Survivors stumbled toward the Urakami River, skin hanging from their arms like rags. In Tokyo, word reached the War Ministry in fragments: first disbelief, then horror. A single bomb destroyed an entire city, someone asked. Impossible, but reconnaissance confirmed it. Hiroshima no longer existed. Then, Nagasaki. 2 cities gone in less than a week. The silence that followed was not of discipline or decorum. It was the silence of men who realized that war itself had changed species. General Anami stood before the Emperor's map of the home islands, his voice hollow. "The gods have abandoned us," he said. Hirohito did not reply. His face was unreadable, but his eyes fixed on the tiny black mark labelled Hiroshima. He whispered almost to himself, "If we continue, there will be no Japan left to defend." Outside, the city was quiet for the first time in months. No sirens, no bombers, only the steady wind sweeping through the burnt districts. Somewhere, a radio still played martial music, its words hollow now against the ash-covered streets. In the ruins of Hiroshima, a soldier searching for survivors found a diary half charred among the rubble. The final line read simply, "There was no honour in extinction." That truth more than any bomb would bring the empire to its knees. August 14th, 1945. The air in Tokyo was thick with humidity and despair. The streets were quiet, not with peace, but with exhaustion. The war had bled the life from every alley, every home, every face that still looked toward the sky. The last radio broadcast still spoke of decisive victory, but even the most devoted listeners no longer believed. They were waiting for something else, an ending. Inside the Imperial Palace, that ending was taking shape behind closed doors. The Supreme War Council had gathered once again. 6 men split evenly between those who would surrender and those who would rather die standing. The debate had raged through the night. The walls of the council chamber, once adorned with the banners of conquest, now echoed with arguments, sobs, and the occasional thud of a fist against wood. General Anami, eyes sunken, insisted that surrender was dishonour. "If the Americans invade, we will destroy them at the beaches. Let the world see our resolve." Foreign Minister Togo, his voice trembling but steady, replied, "And what of our cities already gone? What of our children? If we do not stop, there will be no nation left to protect. The deadlock could not be broken by reason, by strategy, or by pride. Only one voice could decide, and that voice had never before entered such debate. A door opened quietly. Every man in the room rose to his feet, backs bowed. Emperor Hirohito entered, his figure slight, almost fragile beneath the white silk robe. For years he had been a symbol, a distant sun around which all others revolved. But now, for the first time, the divine would speak as a man. He stood at the head of the table. The silence that followed was total, the kind that seemed to erase the sound of the world itself. The war situation Hirohito began has not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage. The understatement hung in the air like a judgment. Every man knew what those words meant. Entire cities gone, armies destroyed, millions displaced. The emperor continued, his tone formal yet sorrowful, a cadence shaped by centuries of imperial ritual. Should we continue to fight, he said, it would not only result in the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but would also lead to the total extinction of human civilization. Some lowered their heads, others wept quietly. He paused, looking at each of them, his generals, his ministers, the architects of a war now beyond control. We must, he said softly, endure the unendurable, bear the unbearable. In that moment the room seemed to exhale as one. The impossible had been spoken not by a general, not by a politician, but by the emperor himself. The divine had chosen surrender over destruction. The spell that had bound Japan for 15 years of conquest, of pride, of mythic invincibility finally broke. The meeting ended not with applause or ceremony, but with silence. Outside, cicadas sang in the palace gardens, their steady rhythm the only sound of life in a dying empire. Hours later, engineers worked to record the emperor's voice on wax discs for broadcast. It would be the first time the Japanese people ever heard him. The technicians bowed before beginning. Their hands trembled as they adjusted the microphone. On the morning of August 15th, 1945, at precisely noon, the broadcast began. Radios crackled to life across the shattered islands. Farmers stopped in their fields. Mothers hushed their children. Soldiers half-starved in bunkers leaned close to the speakers. Then came the voice, distant, formal, almost otherworldly. It spoke in archaic court language that few could fully understand, but everyone felt the meaning. It was the sound of surrender, the end of empire, the echo of humanity breaking through divinity. Many wept. Some refused to believe it. Others, relieved beyond words, simply knelt in the dust. That day, Japan stopped fighting. The war that began in triumph ended in silence, not with gunfire, but with a single sentence that united defeat and dignity. We must bear the unbearable. And so the empire survived not through victory but through the courage to stop dying. In the days that followed, American planes dropped not bombs but food and medicine. The occupation began, and with it a slow rebirth. Tokyo's ruins would one day rise again, built by the same hands that once trembled in fear. But within every survivor the memory remained the firestorms, the loss, the voice that had ended it all. History would record Normandy as the thunder of liberation the moment the Allies began to reclaim the world. But for Japan, the true defeat came not on the battlefield, but in the stillness of that palace chamber. The guns had thundered in Normandy, but Japan's defeat began in silence, behind a locked door where no one dared to speak.